Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming along and to this TEDx Countdown event. And I'd like to speak to you this afternoon about power sharing for nature-based solutions to climate change. So we all know that we are facing a climate emergency, and I know that you know about this and you care about this because you're here with us this afternoon. And we also know that nature plays a key role in responding to that climate emergency. But we also know that we are facing a crisis in biodiversity loss and that ecosystems and habitats are under threat across the world. And that this is happening despite the numerous commitments that have been made at international conferences over decades and through the Convention for Biological Diversity to reverse that trend. Now, the main way that nature has been seen and portrayed as making a contribution or being able to make a contribution to the climate emergency is through nature-based solutions. And nature-based solutions refer to the protection, better management, or restoration of ecosystems to tackle societal challenges. And so in that way, nature-based solutions have the potential to bring benefits to people as well as to nature. And they include approaches like reforestation, landscape restoration, and restoring coastal wetlands. And they sound like an ideal solution to the climate emergency. But there are many critics and criticisms of nature-based solutions. They've been criticised for taking away the focus on the industries, countries, and activities that are largely responsible for the climate emergency. They are criticised for being increasingly dominated by big business and governments, sometimes the very same companies that have been so responsible for causing the climate emergency and for the loss of biodiversity in the first place. Oil and gas companies, for example, have jumped on the bandwagon of nature-based solutions and are investing in these solutions as part of their transition towards net zero carbon. But of course, net zero carbon itself has been criticised for allowing the continuation of the extraction and burning of fossil fuels. Nature-based solutions have also been criticised as being too broad because they allow for the planting of monocultures where there's no diversity in the trees and plants being planted in those reforestation and restoration initiatives. These kinds of criticisms are reflected in a statement made at the recent COP26 meeting by the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, who said that they were deeply concerned about these so-called nature-based solutions that had been developed without their input and without free, prior and informed consent, undermining their own self-determination and secure land tenure. So there have been a lot of criticisms about these nature-based solutions, a lot of concern about the direction that they're going in. So what can be done to save the narrative and actions associated with nature-based solutions to the climate emergency? Well, what needs to happen is that people need to be placed at the centre of nature-based solutions, and particularly those people who live in and near to the very ecosystems that we're seeking to protect, to better manage, and to restore. Now, there have already been calls for nature-based solutions to be centred around Indigenous peoples and local communities. At the recent COP26 meeting, a set of guidelines was presented to the president of the COP26 meeting, Alok Sharma, saying that nature-based solutions should include and centre Indigenous peoples and local communities. So there has already been this recognition. And there's also been suggestions that nature-based solutions should be just, they should be fair, they should recognise the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities to the direct protection of land and associated natural resources. But millions of people, local people, indigenous peoples, have been displaced over decades in the name of conservation, particularly through the formation of protected areas and reforestation programs. And the formation of protected areas is set to continue, which could lead to further displacement of indigenous peoples and local communities. Earlier this year, the UK government secured at the G7 meeting a commitment that 30% of land and 30% of the oceans will be protected by 2030. Now, this sounds like a very good commitment to have made, but it neglects the fact that around 80% of the remaining biodiversity is already protected by indigenous peoples. So again, it's not recognising and centering the role, the important and critical role that indigenous peoples and local communities already play and should be supported. What I'd like to add to these calls for centering indigenous peoples and local communities in nature-based solutions are that lessons can be learned from decades of experience in the governance and management of renewable natural resources across the world, resources such as fisheries, forests, and wildlife. And what I'm talking about in terms of that kind of management are some of the examples that are shown on this slide, where local communities, either on their own through community-based management approaches or working with local and national governments through collaborative approaches, are motivated and incentivized and have responsibility for being involved in managing the natural resources. And I'm going to draw in particular on the experience and context of the Global South, because that's where many nature-based solutions to the climate emergency are and will be developed and put in place, and that's where my own research and experience is based. And what I'm going to focus on in terms of learning lessons from this renewable natural resource governance and management is on how power is shared, because I think that how power is shared is really central to how these kinds of initiatives work and the kinds of outcomes that are experienced for ecosystems and for people. And in particular, I'm going to focus on 3 areas of lessons on power sharing. And that's around how power is shared between governments and local communities. Secondly, how power is shared within local communities. And then thirdly, how power is shared globally in terms of providing and maintaining incentives for sustainable management of natural resources. But what is power in this context? What am I talking about when I talk about power? Well, it refers to having the ability to make decisions and to encourage others to behave in a certain way. And so in this context, those kinds of decisions might be around who has access to natural resources, who can use them, when they can use them, how much they can take, etc. And that power might come from different sources. It might come from having a political mandate, or it might come from legislation, or it might come from having greater wealth and a higher status in society. So the first lesson that we should learn from these kinds of approaches with respect to how power is shared between governments and local communities is that very often what we find is that not enough power is given to local communities. Governments hold on to power. They hold on to the decision making about how the resources are used, and in particular with regard to how revenue is raised and how that income and revenue is used. So as a consequence of this, local people don't really feel invested. They don't feel like they have a say in how those natural resources are used, and they don't really feel like they're benefiting enough. An example of this can be seen in the community forest associations in Kenya, where very often what they're given to manage as part of the arrangements with government is degraded forests, so forests that are not really that productive, and they're not involved in the licensing systems for timber extraction, so they don't have the opportunity to benefit from that revenue either. In contrast, in Namibia, the community conservancies are self-governing and have the legal right to revenue that's raised within the management of their land and wildlife in their conservancy. And so these community conservancies manage around 20% of the country, and whilst they're not perfect, they do have much to offer that we can learn from in creating sustainable, effective, fair and just nature-based solutions to the climate emergency. The second lesson that we can learn with regard to power sharing is about power and how power is shared within communities. The very word community might give us an impression that people are getting along, that they have the same kinds of ambitions and resources, and that all is fine. But actually, as we know, communities are very diverse and heterogeneous. So people have different ambitions, different preferences, and different access to resources and to power. And this can have consequences for how these community-based management and collaborative approaches work. It's very likely that those with greater wealth, higher social status will dominate those structures. And that can be okay because they could have the wider good at the center of their own interests, but it could be problematic. And so in areas such as Nepal and India, where people of lower caste are less likely to be involved in the management of community-based structures, this means that those structures may not serve those interests very well. And across the world, women are less likely to be involved in management groups looking after natural resources. And so this lack of diversity, this lack of representation is a real problem for both the ecosystems and for the communities that those structures seek to serve. So that's an important lesson that we should learn from these community-based and collaborative management approaches. The third lesson that we should learn is about how power is shared globally. Now, decisions made at the global level, such as through the international conferences, including the climate change COP meetings, or perhaps decisions made about how carbon is valued, affect Indigenous peoples and local communities. They affect them by informing decisions about which restoration approaches are adopted, how they're funded, how they're maintained, and who makes decisions. And how is that fair? How could we make sure that those kinds of interests, those voices are heard in the global decision-making arena? So how power is shared globally is really important for the future of nature-based solutions. So I think, as we can see, these collaborative and community-based approaches are not a panacea. They are not perfect, but they have important lessons that we can learn for nature-based solutions to climate change. And these include that local people must feel that they have a say in decision-making, that their voices are heard, and that there is a genuine sharing of power between government and local communities. Nature-based solutions need long-term support, technical support, financial support. It can't be a short-term initiative. These nature-based solutions will take many years, decades, to really bring the sort of benefits that we need. We also need to find ways to enable people who have been marginalised within these community-based management approaches to be much more involved, to have a real say. And we know from experience what kind of ways it can be supported, and we should learn from those. And finally, if we're serious about centering Indigenous people and local communities in nature-based solutions, then we have to make sure that they're compensated for any changes that they have to make in the way that they interact with and benefit from the natural world, and for the time that they take in working with nature-based solutions. So nature-based solutions have a really important role to play in responding to the climate emergency, but we have to make sure that those nature-based solutions are not dominated by the very people, organisations, sectors and activities that cause the environmental destruction and the climate emergency in the first place. That doesn't let the private sector off the hook. They've got to be involved in nature-based solutions, but we must find a way to recognise the importance of Indigenous peoples and local communities and place them at the centre of these solutions to the climate emergency. And in doing that, we must learn from past and ongoing experience about how that in itself can be difficult, because these approaches are not perfect, but we must learn from those imperfections to create a fairer, just solutions to the climate emergency and to global inequalities. And finally, a fairer, just solution for the countries to climate change is for the countries and companies who have been largely responsible for the climate emergency, is for them to accept historical responsibility and to demonstrate that acceptance of historical responsibility by stopping the burning of fossil fuels and providing realistic financial support to those people and parts of the world that are being and will be so adversely affected by climate change. So nature-based solutions don't provide the be-all and end-all solution to the climate emergency. They are part of the response, but ultimately what we really must do is stop the burning of fossil fuels. Thank you.